Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into the ancient, incredibly timeless text of Genesis chapter 9, and honestly, it's a fascinating journey. It takes us from the epic, dramatic aftermath of a literal global catastrophe, right down into the quiet, messy, private struggles of a single family. We're going to explore how God's massive, eternal promises intersect directly with our highly flawed, everyday human realities. It's a deep dive into grace, heavy responsibility, and, well, the reality of what it actually means to be human. Let's get into it. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with judgment, grace, and covenant, move into the sanctity of life, look at authority and temperance, discuss covering sins, and finish up with some reflection. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Judgment, Grace, and the Noahic Covenant. We're picking up right in the immediate aftermath of the global flood, looking at God's proactive solution to a really persistent human problem. So our sources highlight a deeply profound truth about the flood, and it's kind of a heavy one. The flood washed the physical earth, absolutely, but it didn't wash the human heart. The waters brought a definitive end to rampant violent sin on a global scale, but they literally couldn't drown what theologians called the old Adam. That deeply ingrained sinful human nature, yeah, it survived right there on the ark. The physical world got a hard reset, but the core spiritual disease remained entirely intact. And that exact reality is what makes God's response so amazing. He knew the flood didn't cure the human heart. So, instead of promising endless cycles of destruction, he meets humanity with an overwhelming preemptive promise of grace. This is where God establishes the Noahic covenant. And what's wild here is that God is intentionally limiting himself out of pure grace. This contract is unilateral, meaning God sets it up without requiring humanity to meet a single condition first, which is a good thing because humanity couldn't keep those conditions anyway. It's universal, applying to Noah, his descendants, and literally all living creatures. It's an eternal promise to never destroy the earth with a flood again, and it's sealed with a divine sign. Basically, God is voluntarily stepping down and binding himself to this permanent agreement to protect humanity, fully knowing our hearts haven't fundamentally changed. And to seal the deal, we get this famous sign, "I have set my rainbow in the clouds." Now, the original Hebrew text actually uses the word for a warrior's bow. Think about that for a second. Think about the shape of a rainbow in the sky. It looks exactly like an archer's bow, right? But notice how it's pointing upward toward heaven, rather than aimed down at the earth. It brilliantly represents peace and comfort. God is basically hanging up his weapon on the wall. The war is over. It's a spectacular visual guarantee of his enduring grace, literally taking the threat off humanity and pointing it away from us. Moving smoothly into Section 2, the sanctity of life. Here's where we see this grand covenant drill down into some very specific dietary and moral laws for a freshly restored earth. So after the flood, God permits humanity to eat meat for the very first time. But he issues a strict prohibition: do not consume the blood. Why? Because the life of the flesh is in the blood. By avoiding it, humans are forced to show deep reverence for the Creator, the only one who has the right to give and take life. But there is a much deeper layer here, something called biblical typology. Typology is essentially when a historical event or physical rule acts as a preview for a massive spiritual truth thousands of years later. This physical rule against eating blood is a profound setup. It perfectly foreshadows Christ's ultimate plan of redemption. It acts as a daily dietary reminder, training humanity across generations to understand that life is unimaginably precious, and that ultimately, only the pure, atoning blood of Christ can truly cover our sin. But God's protection of life doesn't stop at dietary laws. When it comes to human life, there is exactly one core reason given for God's incredibly severe penalty on murder. Just one. For in the image of God has God made mankind. This right here is the absolute bedrock foundation of human dignity. Taking a life or even harboring deep-seated hatred isn't just a physical crime against another biological organism. It's a direct assault on the very image, dignity, and nature of God himself. Because we bear God's likeness, attacking a person is fundamentally an act of ultimate disrespect toward the Creator. Think about the practical implications here. When we snap at someone in traffic or harbor intense resentment towards someone we politically disagree with, we are degrading someone made in the divine image. This ancient text is giving us a massive reality check, reminding us to actively recognize the divine reflection in every single person we encounter. All right, Section 3, Authority, temperance, and vigilance. We're pivoting now from divine decrees back to raw human frailty, looking at the ultimate cautionary tale of Noah's vineyard. Just think about this narrative for a moment. Noah is the undisputed hero of the flood. He literally navigated a global apocalypse. Yet, he plants a vineyard, makes some wine, and gets completely drunk, lying exposed and vulnerable inside his tent. It's a stark reminder that even the most righteous of 40 figures can completely fall apart in times of ease. The progression here is startling. First, that lingering old Adam nature we talked about, it rears its head. Second, there is a total lack of temperance and vigilance, and notably it happens in private. And third, this private lapse leads directly to a massive loss of spiritual witness and authority before his family. Modern believers, take note. This proves we have to live a life of temperance and maintain our vigilance at all times. Authority figures aren't usually taken down in public battles. They're most vulnerable in moments of private ease.
Which brings us to Section 4, covering sins. Noah's private failure immediately tests his family, giving us a masterclass on how we should and shouldn't handle the failures of others.
We see two vastly different reactions unfold. First, there's Ham. He walks in, sees his father's shameful state, and immediately runs outside to broadcast the sin to his brothers. His absolute eagerness to expose the shame, rather than protect his father, fractures the family and leads to a curse. But then, look at the stark contrast with Shem and Japheth. They take a garment, put it across their shoulders, and intentionally walk backward into the tent. They don't even look at their father's shame while respectfully covering him up. It is an incredible demonstration of spiritual wisdom, choosing to preserve someone's dignity rather than capitalizing on their worst moment. These ancient actions hit totally different today, don't they? We live in an internet call-out culture that literally delights in the moral failures and public exposure of others. But this text is urging us in the exact opposite direction. Do not delight when someone stumbles, protect their dignity. Let grace and love cover their private sins, just as Shem and Japheth physically covered their father. Restore the fallen with profound humility. True spiritual maturity means demonstrating the wisdom to cover the private transgressions of our fellow believers with love, rather than serving them up for public ridicule.
Finally, Section 5, reflection. Let's load up 3 thought-provoking questions to help transform all this data into personal application.
Question 1. How does the imagery of the rainbow remind us of God's patience and grace during our own personal storms and spiritual failures? Seriously, consider how God's macro-level promise to never destroy the earth applies directly to your own daily struggles. When you see that bow pointed up to heaven, let it be a reminder that God knows all about that lingering old Adam inside of you, yet he intentionally chooses to extend grace rather than immediate judgment. Question 2. In what practical ways can we uphold the sanctity of life in our daily interactions, especially recognizing the image of God in those we disagree with? How does that ancient prohibition of violence translate to your life today? How do you actively respect the divine image in the people who frustrate you the absolute most? Does this change the way you speak to people online or in your own home? And I want to leave you with this final provocative thought for question 3. How can we balance the call for personal vigilance with the grace required to cover the transgressions of our fellow believers? How do we hold ourselves and our leaders to a strict standard of temperance and holiness while simultaneously extending that radical covering love of Shem and Japheth when someone inevitably stumbles? It is an incredibly delicate, beautiful balance between pursuing purity and dispensing profound grace. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really encourage you to take these questions, chew on them, discuss them with your group, and see how they change your week. Catch you next time.